Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. In this installment of my shed building series, I'm going to be installing sheathing on my side walls, building out my Eave overhangs, and putting in my sub fascias. I'm sharing this video for reference or entertainment purposes only. I'm not a carpenter or an expert in building by any stretch of the imagination, so keep that in mind when you watch through this series. There may be some things here that you'll find helpful, or maybe you'll see some mistakes I'm making along the way. Either way, what I show here isn't necessarily what you should do if you were building a shed. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's get on with the project. So the sheathing that I'm going to be using is LP Smart Siding that I got at Home Depot. Originally, I had planned on using Texture 111, but when I started researching my options, I found that the Smart Side paneling was going to be a little bit better option for me for a few reasons. Now, the first thing I liked about the Smart Siding is that it's advertised to be a little more weatherproof than regular Texture 111, so it theoretically should last longer, even though it's thinner than traditional Texture 111. Another thing I liked about it is that it's pre-primed, and that's going to save me some time later on when I go to paint this shed, and buy me a little bit of time actually, since I'm working on this sort of in the fall and completely by myself. If I do get enough done to paint this before it gets too cold, I'll do that, but if this has to sit all winter, at least these panels are protected with the primer that's already on them. Now, one advantage to them being thinner and lighter is that because I'm working on this completely by myself and I'm kind of a short guy, they're a little bit easier to handle than a regular sheet of Texture 111. So to help position and hold up my sheathing, I screwed a couple of scrap 2x4s to my sleepers down below, and I've also got my ladder over here to help hold the sheathing against the wall while I kind of fine-tune its final position. So I've got my panel positioned so this corner is squared up to the corner of the base, and I'm going to put just one screw in for now to kind of hold it in place. So now I'm going to pivot the panel so that the top corner lines up here to the top corner of the framing. And now I'm going to put a screw in up here to hold it in place. So I've looked over the panel and it's squared up the way that I want to the cord of the roof truss and the two wall studs on either side. And the overhang on the bottom looks like it's correct too. So I'm going to put screws every 16 inches or so down this side. And then I'll put screws inside the grooves along the top edge and then down the sides where they line up with the wall studs. These panels are designed to overlap each other a bit on the seams. So for that reason, I'm not going to put any screws on this joist right now. I'm going to wait until I put the next panel in and kind of screw them in place together. So I've got my second panel positioned, and I've used the shim under here to make sure everything is at the right level. Again, I'm going to put one screw down here in this corner and then position the top and pin that in place. Now that I have the bottom half of the walls done, I need to do the top half, which means I need to cut some panels to fit the slope of the roof. So I'm going to come over here at the 4-foot mark where these two panels overlap and measure my height from the top of the rafter. So that being said, the distance from the top of the rafter to where the panels meet down here is 32 inches. Now I'll measure the top of the rafter to the end of the panel and we'll get a distance there. And the height I'm measuring at the end of the panel is 4.5 inches. So I really don't have a decent table to work from, and this panel's pretty warped. So I've got my measurements on either end figured out, and I'm going to use a 2x4 as my straight edge. I'm going to clamp this down so it kind of flattens out, and then I'll draw a line to mark where I want to cut. So now I'm going to move my 2x4 1.5 inches off the line that I drew, so I can use it as a sort of a fence for my circular saw to help guide it and keep the cut fairly straight. I've got my panel cut and lined up over here on this side, so I'm just going to use that clamp to hold it in place. Now before I put any screws in here, I want to get up here on the ladder and double check the top and make sure it's not rising above the rafter at all. And that actually looks pretty good. It's right flush with the top of the rafter. So I had to hop off the ladder to see this side, but this looks like it's all lined up and in good shape. So now I'll put some screws in. So next, instead of laying out the next panel in line, I'm actually going to go to the other side and lay out sort of the opposite diagonal panel. And the reason for that is maximum material utilization. So on the opposite wall, the way I've got the paneling set up is that the back of the lap joint is on sort of the front wall. So that means this angle is already set up and ready to go for that front piece. So all I should have to do is measure out my distances straight down here and on the opposite side of the panel. And then I should be able to do just a straight cut, and then this panel should fit on the front. And then I have another straight edge to work from for my next set of cuts. So this panel fits just fine, but I'm not going to screw it on just now. The lap joints are set up so that the bottom part of the lap joint would be here, and this is sort of the top part. So just so I don't have any problems trying to put these together later, I'm just going to set this aside for now and move on to the next panel. So now I'm going to measure out the centerpiece on this side. Now of course this is going to have 2 angles cut in it, so we're going to start over here, and I've already measured this one, and this of course is 32 inches, which is what it was on the other board. Now I'll measure the center, and then we'll double check this side, but this one really should be 32 inches too, if everything is square. 45 1/4. And just like on the other side, we're getting 32 inches over here. $31 1/2, 45. So the siding panels are all installed on the sides of the shed, so I'm ready to start building my eave extensions. So way back when I made my rafters, I cut a set of extras for the ends. So all I need to do now is cut some spacer blocks to screw into the sides of the end trusses through the siding panels, and then I can put those final rafters on the ends, and that should create the eave overhangs. So now I'm just going to figure out the length of standoff blocks that I need to create my eave overhangs. I want an 8-inch overhang, so I have to subtract the thickness of this board, which is 1.5 inches, and the thickness of the siding panels, which is 3/8 inch. So I'll just cut a bunch of these blocks from all my scrap that I saved, and then I should be able to build out my overhangs from that. So I've got a screw started on my side of the rafter. I've got the block positioned and the angle clocked roughly where it looks like it's right. And I'm going to sink this first screw the rest of the way. I'll double check my angle, and then I'll put my other screw in the bottom. Now I'll repeat the process roughly every foot or so down this side of the rafter and down the other. As you can see, I've got all the blocks installed on the side of the shed. So before I put the end rafter on, I'm going to put a few things in place to help me hold and guide it since I'm working by myself. The first thing I'll put up is this L-shaped block. I'm going to put it on this very end block, and that'll help hold the end of this board while I get it kind of aligned and screwed in place at the top. The next thing I'm going to do is put a couple of these scrap pieces across 2 of the rafters and have them sticking out past the blocks. And these will span a couple of the rafters inside the shed and stick out past the end of the wall. When I slide the end rafter up in place, I can butt it up against the bottom surface of the board, and I'll know that it's in line with the other rafters. So I lined up the edge of my rafter to the peak of the truss behind it, and I've got it butted flush up against my scrap boards. I'm going to put 1 screw here in sort of in the middle of the rafter. So now I'll double check the ends, make sure everything's lined up where it should be, and then I can put the rest of the screws in to hold this in place. As you can see, I've got the other end rafter in place. And this time I have a support block on the top and the bottom to kind of help hold everything. It was a little dicey last time without having one up here on this side. So I've got my overhangs all set. Now I'm going to work on putting on my sub fascia boards. So again, because I'm working by myself, I'm going to use this helper block and I'm going to screw it to the joist that's down sort of near the 8-foot mark to start getting my fascia propped up in the front. So I'm going to be working with 8-foot boards for my sub fascia. Now the way this is going to lay out, I need to cut 3/4 of an inch off the length of my first fascia board. So I'm going to go do that now before I install it. Now that I've got my board cut to length, I'm going to line this up so the end of it is halfway through the width of this very end rafter. Later on I'm going to come back and put a short piece to complete this section of the overhang. And I've also got my fascia board lined up to the bottom of the rafters here. So now I'm just going to start screwing it in place. Before I put the rest of the screws in, I'm going to step off the ladder, step back a few feet, take a look at this and make sure it's lined up the way that I want. So the subfascias and the overhangs are all set. Now what I want to do is put the rest of the panels on the front and the back. I had considered waiting to do those until after I put the roof sheathing on and sort of the soffit boards, because I thought maybe it would be a little easier to put the soffit boards on if the wall boards weren't in the way. But I've got all the siding boards in my trailer right here behind me just out of the camera view. And I need the trailer space to get the rest of the plywood home. So since that's the case, I'm going to put the rest of the siding boards on now. So I've got room in my trailer for the roof plywood. So one last thing before I put the siding panels on. I actually want to put an extra stud at each of the corners, sort of overlapping this one. So that if I ever want to put any kind of paneling or boards in here, I've got something to nail to over on these corners. So just like I did on the sides, I put a guide board down here to support the panel while I get it screwed in place. So I've got my first one kind of roughly positioned. I'm just going to double check it's squared up the way that I want, and I'll just screw it in from right to left. And another thing to keep in mind, I've positioned these so that the base of the overlap is over on this stud, and then the outer part of the next panel will overlap here, and I'll work my way down the wall. And another thing to mention, these panels have warped on me a bit because I had to leave them out overnight during a rainstorm. So when I screw them in, everything should be okay as long as I work from one side and work my way over so that I push the bow along as I go. So I've got all the panels installed along the back wall, and I'm starting to work on the front panels today. So I didn't really capture a ton of footage of me doing anything with those back panels, partly because it was starting to rain, partly because I was rushing, and partly because I was actually struggling a little bit with getting the panels aligned the way that I wanted to. And I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer to this front panel and show you what I mean. So up at the top of this panel, you can see that I've got a 2x4 screwed into it. And the reason for that is to keep it straight. Now on the other back panels, I didn't do that. Like I said, it was raining and I was rushing. Now all of those panels, and actually all the ones that I have left for the front wall, are significantly bowed in the middle. So what happened is when I tried to install them, even though I had a guide block down at the bottom of the shed, because the panels were bowed, they were hitting this tapered rafter and not going up into place where they needed to, up here where the rafter meets the top of the wall. So subsequently, all of those panels are shifted down about an inch, inch and a half in some cases, lower than they really need to be. Now I probably should have stopped on those back panels and cooled off a little bit before I installed them the rest of the way. But I figured they were on the back of the shed. Nobody's going to see it. So if they're off a little bit, I can hide it with trim later on and kind of deal with it. I just wanted to get things done that day. So today's a better day. The sun's out. I'm not as rushed. So I came up with this idea of screwing a 2x4 to the panel to flatten it out so that I could get it put up in here and flush with where the rafter and the wall comes together. I think this is going to work out much better. So I've got this panel positioned right where I want it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a few screws in just to hold it and make sure it's nice and flush to the wall. Then what I'm going to do is go inside the shed. You can probably see here in the corner of the shot that this is the door opening. And I'm going to trace out the opening and then take the panel back down off the shed and cut the material out from where the door opening is. So one thing I need to keep in mind is that I haven't removed this board from the bottom plate of the wall yet. Eventually this is going to have to get cut out of here so that I don't have it in the way when I open up the doors. Anyway, I've made my mark here at the edge of the board, but I'll actually have to cut this 1.5 inches lower down in order to clear the door opening. Okay, so now I'm just going to pull this panel off of here and cut the opening in it. Okay, now that the panel is cut, I've got it back in place and I'll just screw it in the rest of the way and then move on down the line. So the next panel in line is going to fall fully within that door opening, so I don't need to put a whole sheet up and cut around it. I can actually use some of my scraps from the sides to cut the strip that I need for the top and bottom. So I've already measured things out, and I'll need just a 14-inch wide strip at the top and about a 4 1/8 at the bottom. So I'm going to go cut those now. So the siding is all set. Now I can start putting plywood on the roof. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more in the shed building series, check the links in the description below. Thanks for watching. My blocking up here, edge, the inner edge of this stud, is 32. Really?